As Dr. Goddard said, I'm involved in this really cool project regarding the cemeteries of the San Luis Valley. And so actually, cemetery studies really isn't a new idea in the field of anthropology. It was, cemeteries are really just kind of a 3D census. Everyone ends up there eventually. James Deets in the 1970s actually pioneered this idea of looking at cemeteries as kind of a record of not just the people who lived in the past, when they were born, when they died, but of how they thought about things like death, the afterlife in a religious context, social structures, and one of the things he looked at, he focused primarily on tombstone iconography in kind of colonial New England, specifically in Massachusetts. And one of the things he noted was that we see a shift from this, which is called a death's head. We see this in a lot of Puritan tombstones, and around the mid-1700s, we see a shift to this kind of cherub figure, which suggests a much gentler view of death. So he talks about kind of this idea of iconography denoting shifts in religious or social attitudes. And so a lot of his students kind of carried his ideas forward. The token Marxist of the field is a guy named Randall McGuire, and he actually argues that rather than Deets' perspective that the cemetery is just a passive record of social shifts, that the cemetery itself actually is kind of an active participant in a way for cementing the social systems of the living. One of the things he talks about is Binghamton, New York, which is kind of a manufacturing town in upstate New York. And he talks about the idea that the guy who built this in about the 1870s or so, a guy named Joseph Kilmer, he is a person who would end up, this is where he lives now. And for a little bit of context, you could build about 10 or so middle-class homes with what it took to build that one mausoleum. Classism at work. So, knowing all that kind of background about what people have done in the field before I started, these are some of the questions I started with when I was figuring out how to approach this study of cemeteries within the San Luis Valley. I wanted to look at how the culture of the valley is reflected in its cemeteries, how the different religious and ethnic groups that make the valley home manifest in their iconography and even the layout of their cemeteries. I also wanted to look at what historic events are marked by changes in iconography or other structures within the cemetery. And then I also wanted to look at what are the ways that different communities differentiate themselves from one another? What are the specific symbols that they use? What are the, how can we look at a tombstone and say, yes, this individual was very clearly a Catholic, or something of that nature. And so, the first question is kind of broad, kind of what I'm going to be talking about overall. The second question, what historical events are presented through the specific tombstones. I found this tombstone in the Alamosa Municipal Cemetery. It's a 2-day-old baby who died in 1945, and around her are buried 2 other children from the same parents. And what's interesting is the very Japanese name and the date range, 1945. Her siblings are died in 1942 and 1944, respectively. If you're not familiar with that period of American history, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a push by the American government to round up Japanese Americans off the West Coast. Well, Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, round them up off the West Coast and take them to camps farther inland, including Camp Amache, which is Colorado's very own internment camp, which is out on the Eastern Plains. Which, if you've ever been out on the Eastern Plains, you know that's kind of cruel and unusual punishment in itself. So the story that this tombstone specifically can tell us, the San Luis Valley actually had a very well-established population of Japanese Americans. And so before the involuntary relocation, there was a period of voluntary relocation where if you had the resources and perhaps family farther inland, you could move to somewhere of your choice as long as it wasn't California, Oregon, or Washington. I'm not exactly sure what the story of this family specifically is, but it could be that they had family in the valley and were forced to join that family here, and they lost their children, and they're buried here in Alamosa. The other possibility is that maybe they didn't have the resources to move on their own, and they would have ended up in Camp Amache, and if they had family here, these children may have died in the internment camp and been transported here to the valley rather than be buried among strangers in the internment camp to be buried here closer to family, which is a really kind of a depressing story, but something we can learn from a local tombstone. The other historical event that I wanted to talk about is this giant block of granite is in the Antonito Cemetery. Fred Warschauer was a local sheep rancher and banker around the turn of the last century. In about 1911, he began construction on this brick mansion to replace the very large, very wooden Queen Anne Victorian that had burned to the ground several years earlier. He started construction on this in about 1911, and in 1913, he was found in one of the outbuildings on his ranch with a gunshot wound to the head. I know, very gruesome. The gun laying next to him. Now, frontier forensics being what they were, we might never know if Fred Warschauer actually committed suicide, but that's what the evidence looks like. And so one of the interesting things about his tombstone is that if you look at the Alamosa Cemetery, there's a Catholic side and a Protestant side, and then there are two irrigation ditches that run parallel in between. Fred Warschauer is in between those ditches. He is actually technically in neither cemetery. So even within the larger community of Antonito, there are smaller sub-communities that have existed for as long as Antonito has been a thing. Neither of those communities really wants the Warschauers. So one of the other things I looked at was how different cultural communities represent themselves on their tombstones. And this is one of the really interesting tombstones I found in Antonito. This is a very modern tombstone. Judging by the materials and the carving, I'd say it's no later than the 1970s. Or no, earlier than the 1970s, excuse me. And so, for those of you who are familiar with Mormons, that building is very common on Mormon tombstones. However, if you look at the dates George Washington over there on the left died in 1887. Their daughter died in 1882. Sally died in 1928. And if you look actually at this kind of strip of concrete at the bottom, there are two very typical Victorian tombstones for George and Carrie. White marble, kind of in pieces, but they've been preserved at the base of this newer headstone. Now, if you look at the back, is the really interesting part. There's a list of George and Sally's kids. There's Carrie, who died when she was about a few months old, and then there's George and Homer. Homer died in 1972, so I'm willing to bet that Homer is responsible for this much newer tombstone. And if George and Sally were not Mormon, I'm pretty sure Homer was. So noting that religious shift, even within a family, is kind of cool. So one of the things that's kind of in progress for me, the study is very much not done, the semester isn't done. I've been looking at the phenomena of crypto-Jews. Now, crypto-Jews are a group of people typically called conversos that during the Spanish Inquisition, they were Jewish individuals who converted to Catholicism to escape torture and death. And then, understandably not wanting to quit being Jewish, a lot of them moved to New Spain, which would later become Mexico. And then as New Spain started to urbanize and get increasingly more Catholic, they just moved farther and farther north. So, given the nature of the group was to avoid detection, as a historian, one of my challenges is how do you find people whose entire purpose was to avoid being identified as, in this case, Jewish. So one of the theories is that there are specific pieces of iconography that you can use to find people of perhaps a hidden Jewish heritage. My goal is to test that theory by finding people who are probably of a Jewish heritage through genetics. There's a rare form of breast cancer that the genetic marker manifests almost exclusively in Ashkenazi Jews. And several cases have cropped up here in the valley in ostensibly Hispanic Catholic women. So my hope is to use the genetics component combined with the genealogical record, if I can find someone in those families who, say, crossed the Atlantic during the Spanish Inquisition, that'd be really cool. And then once I have that, to work backward through the material culture and the iconography of those tombstones, if I can locate them, to see if I can find evidence for that theory of kind of a hidden iconography that would denote people of this group. So that's my main mystery. Another mystery I came upon that I just think is really weird. In the Antonito Cemetery, there are about 3 or 4 fenced in what we call family plots, about 3 to 5 headstones per plot, which is not in itself weird, except all of them, this is one of those stones, all of them are young women. There are, and nearest I can figure, only 2 or 3 of them could be related to each other. All of them died sometime before 1930. This is one of the later date ranges that I've found. And I really just don't know what's going on. The temptation would be to say they could be nuns, except they're in the Protestant side of the cemetery, and with them, baby Thomas Patrick. Probably not nuns. So that's kind of one of the things I'm wrestling with, trying to figure out why are these people buried the way that they are, which really, at its core, is really the question I'm trying to answer with the whole study. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Does anyone have questions?
What inspires your studies here?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Actually, it's mostly Goddard's fault. I'm gonna be upfront with that. About Halloween last semester, I went to him and I asked if he had any, academic, if anyone had done any sort of academic work on cemeteries, because that's always been a thing I've been interested in. And he turned and he looked at his bookcase for about 6 seconds, and then he turned back to me and he said, do you just want to make an independent study out of this? Yes. So I've always been interested in cemeteries, but he really gave me the opportunity to pursue it as a serious academic survey.
Have you had the opportunity to talk to somebody with knowledge?
I have not, and I would really like to. That would be one of my next steps going forward.
So have you seen any sort of kind of deviations from these older records that are, at least seem to be about 100 years old, and the living people in the San Luis Valley now? Is there any sort of thing that strikes out as, there seems to be a really high proportion of this, and nowadays there isn't or is?
That is a really interesting question. I think that one of the things that strikes me most is that if you look at older cemeteries and older sections of cemeteries, the segregation of like Hispanic versus Anglo names, there's a very clear delineation of Hispanics are buried over here, Anglo names are buried over here. And as you get closer and closer to present day, that kind of dissipates, and those groups are getting more and more integrated.
Are you from the valley, or did you just pick these stuff at random?
I am actually from up in Denver. I'm really interested in the culture of the valley because I don't know a lot about it. So this has been kind of an interesting way for me to kind of find out about that for myself. Any other questions? Yes? No? All right, cool. Thank you so much.